You know, I think we are under the great hammer blows of homogenizing from the United States. I mean, I just found out today, this sounds like making propaganda, but the person who's in charge of relations with the high schools over English literature from my university, McMaster, goes out and recommends to the high school 10 books that they should read in English literature, and they're all American books. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, that kind of homogenizing is simply fantastic. Well, you know, Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be Americans. I mean, I'm saying this to you who know more about this than certainly than I do. And I think the French have gone on knowing, to some extent, though they are very deeply influenced by technique and by great corporations, I think the French have gone on knowing why they are not Americans. I think it's very hard for English-speaking Canadians.
Well, George, you're a philosopher and a professor of religion, but a great deal of your writing seems to me to deal with public affairs. Does that get you in trouble with your fellow philosophers?
Well, you know, philosophers in the English-speaking world have been mainly interested in certain logical questions and not very interested in the public world. But I don't think it gets me in any trouble because I don't think they're very interested.
Well, how do you explain your own ability to escape what you call modern philosophy? That is to say, you are kind of an outsider in terms of modern philosophy. Is it in your education or your family background?
Well, questions about oneself are always, one is not a very good observer. I think I think people are done by generations. I noticed with my older sisters, the Depression was the big thing for them. Now, certainly the Depression wasn't the big thing for them compared to the war. And these big events that form people do cast differences between generations. And certainly I would say that the 39 war was the enormous thing for me.
What did you do during the war?
Well, I was, at the beginning of the war, I was a pacifist because I had been brought up, I had just taken for granted. I had been part of the generation that thought that, and for a long, then I was in England. I had gone over to study after leaving Queen. I was in England. So when the war got intense, I was in charge of a part of East London which was being very badly bombed, and then I went into the British Merchant Navy. Now, God knows, if you ask me whether I was right to be a pacifist, I just don't know.
Uh-huh.
I was of the... I thought the war was inconceivable, when it broke out. I was, people growing up in Toronto today are much more sophisticated. I don't think you can imagine what a simple person, what a simple person I was at that time.
Well, I find it hard to believe that you were a simple person, George. You're...
But society was given, wasn't it, much more? I took for granted I was going to be ambitious, get on, sort of become a lawyer or something, go into politics. The forms of society were very much given. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Canada was a very small country, after all, till about 1940.
Your university background in Canada was at Queen's, is that right?
Yeah.
And your grandfather had once been the principal of Queen's.
Yeah.
And then you went to, before you went to Queen's, you went to Upper Canada.
Yeah.
So in some sense, one might say that you were a member or a scion of an establishment family.
Yeah.
Was that your own sense of life in those days? That you could do anything you wanted, go on and do anything you wanted?
I don't think anything you wanted, but I took for granted, I never forget when I was very poor after the war. I suddenly realized I had to get some money to buy a house. Well, I thought when I grew up, when I was young, my family weren't rich at all, though there was money round. But I just took for granted houses were given, everything, and that you got jobs and the world was very easily arranged.
Did you go to Oxford after Queen's?
Yeah.
To study philosophy?
No, to study law.
Oh, to study law, so that you really had intended very explicitly
to be a lawyer.
Yeah. Well, at what point did your mind change about that?
Oh, the war.
The war did that.
The war. And, you know, I saw, through the bombing later, I saw a great deal of violent things. And found the war pretty unsupportable. But I think I was converted. I would only say I was converted. I was totally, you know, I was brought up at the center of a certain, not the center, but it was a very dominant thing in the eastern seaboard of the United States, in certain parts of Canada and in England, a certain kind of liberalism. And for a vast variety of reasons, some, you know, totally private and others, the war and things like that, I came to realize that this was coming to an end. This could no longer be believed.
You mean by liberalism a belief in the perfectibility of man or in the perfectibility of society, do you?
What I mean by English-speaking liberalism is really a certain form of secularized Christianity. And for a long time, the death of Western Christianity was not clear because a kind of secular Christianity, either in American liberalism or in a certain way in Marxism, sort of kept this going. But I think both of them are through.
That's finished,
cannot be thought. Cannot be thought anymore.
Some years ago now, I suppose 8 years ago, you wrote a book called Lament for a Nation, in which you said that it was really that Canadian nationalism was dead, that it had become homogenized in this process. Could you tell me, George, what you think it was that died? What was it about Canada that had made it a different country than its neighbor to the south or to the English-speaking world in general?
No, it's hard. It's hard. Well, you know, Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be Americans. I mean, I'm saying this to you who know more about this than certainly than I do. And now I think the French have gone on knowing, to some extent, though they are very deeply influenced by technique and by great corporations, I think the French have gone on knowing why they are not Americans. I think it's very hard for English-speaking Canadians to know why they're.
Do you think in the French-Canadian case it was the continued strength and importance of their religious values?
I don't like the word values. I think of their religion and of their speech. Now they've largely given up their religion, you know, or at least they've given up a very ancient and very remarkable religion for a rather cheap one at the moment, I think. But they've, and what is going to happen to them without that religion is very hard to say. You know, I'm not, I don't know, you know, I don't know enough. You know much more about French Canada than I do, much more. But I don't see much hope in this kind of sort of Marxist French nationalism. I don't think they're going to build in Quebec and a society that keeps itself different from the United States in that way. I just don't see any hope in that.
In other words, where some French-Canadian nationalists these days would say that they are modernizing their society and building a new and different society in North America, in your terms, they're really becoming more like the rest of us.
Yes, I would think so. In
the very
ways.
sense of modernization.
Yes, in many ways. In many ways.
Well, to go back to the English-Canadian side of this for the moment, you have a sense, however, that our society, our English-speaking society, was once much more differentiated from the United States than now.
Well, I don't, you know, I think people, and you know, when I wrote the book, anger is a bad motive for a philosopher at any point, and I have to defend darling Mr. Diefenbaker parts of it. Therefore, some things I said were rather extreme. But I think this, too, you know, the possibility of building on, you know, that English-speaking Canadians were going to be different from this great, enormous empire down to the south. You know, it may have been an impossible hope from the very beginning. And, mind you, I think one thing that is very hard, and people have been brought up in liberalism find it very hard. I think it is much harder to resist a capitalist empire than a communist empire. Because a communist empire works through the state and directly moves in brutal injustice. But a capitalist, capitalist imperialism is a very subtle and amazing thing, as we know from the great corporations. And it's extremely hard for indigenous organizations to withstand.
You mean in the sense that it produces a certain amount of pleasure in the course of rape?
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Do you think the rest of us would have a better chance or a poorer chance of surviving if we didn't have French Canada?
Well, I don't think we'd have a chance at all. I mean, it is inconceivable to me to have Canada without French Canada. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? I mean, these people who talk about being Canadian nationalists and then are hostile to French Canada, I just don't even know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. I just literally don't know what they're talking about.
People talk about something that as this kind of society we live in these days as a technological society, and it seems to me that when that term is used, it means in effect that the world is full of machinery and technology and so on. But when you use the term technological society, you mean something much more all-encompassing than that, don't you? In fact, you don't use the word technological society. You use the term, you used it a moment ago, you use the term technique.
Yes, well, I think technological is just, it was a neologism invented in the United States in the 1850s. And it's like, you wouldn't talk about life as biology. Biology is the study of life. Well, technology is the study of technique. That's why I like the word technique better. Technique
is not all that machinery out there, but technique is the way that man thinks about his world.
Yes, I think just the fact that science looks at the world as object means it looks at the world in a particular way. It relates to the world in a particular way. I know people are always saying that, this is the simplest level. People are saying, that all the little inventions of technique don't influence, or can be used one way or another. The automobile doesn't impose on us the ways it should be used. But for instance, the automobile has we can use it, but it has entirely shaped us, in a certain sense. It has entirely shaped the history of this country, for instance. When you take an automobile which is the same which we needed, you see, in a certain sense. It shapes us. I just don't think that you can look. I go from the automobile to the most extreme theoretical other way. Algebra. Algebra is a particular notation. And it's extremely interesting that the Greeks turned their back on algebra directly. Now, algebra is a particular abstract notation which dominates the way you look at the world. And in that sense, you see certain things and not other things. And it's this is why I so greatly admire a philosopher who's not much admired in the English-speaking world, but I think was a very great philosopher, Nietzsche. I think he saw, this early with enormous clarity, that modern science was an amazing theoretical and practical achievement, but he saw at the same time he utterly accepted it, and yet saw how killing it was to men at a certain point.
One of the aspects of modern technological society, or the impact of technique on modern society, as I understand it from your writing, is the creation of an increasingly homogeneous world.
Yes.
That all cultural or national differentiations are being wiped out.
Of course.
Is this one of the consequences of technique, that it makes everything uniform?
In terms of modern science, it sees the world entirely as object. And the world as object is the same one place as another. You know, we find this with all this question about Canada and universities. I mean, you could never get chemists to see any of the point, because chemistry is the same wherever it is done.
You mean the question of whether Canadian universities should be different from American or some other?
Yes, quite. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the point is that at the heart of science is summoning forth things to stand before them to give their reasons, that is, to be objects for them. And objects are the same everywhere. Now, in that sense, scientific society led to homogenization. But I think also modern moral philosophy believed, and it was a rather fine, a fine belief, that the end of history was to build the universal society of free and equal men. And that it was all these local differences that had caused wars and everything like that. I think this was, I think modern liberalism went directly with modern science. You know, they came out of the same spirit and they went together. Now the question remains whether this universal society of free and equal men, if that as a goal of human striving does not lead directly to tyranny. That is the question. Mm-hmm. You know, whether the consequence of this extreme homogenization is not tyranny.
Some kind of general tyranny of the developed world?
What tyranny will be like when it has enormous technical weapons is very hard to say, but I mean, we are clearly moving towards it in a rather sort of series of great imperial powers at the moment who control within certain areas. And now, I don't think tyranny is I think one of the strange things about modern tyranny is it's not going to appear often very nasty. You know, it's not going to be a wild, crazy, romantic tyranny like, romantic is the nasty word, like National Socialism. But I mean, there is a kind of, well, let me say what I think the tyranny of the United States is going to be. At a sort of late state capitalist stage, it's going to be the mental health state. It'll be the mental health state. It'll be the tyranny of the mental health organization.
Well, this all sounds very Orwellian. Is Orwell a thinker in your?
No, if you go back to the early thinkers, I would be closer to old Huck. I think Brave New World is a clear. I don't think it's going to be. I think it's going to be done in a much smoother way. Do you know what I mean? I mean, you'll be able to control. With the morning after birth control pill, you'll be able to, and water control, so people could, have to get licensed to get children. I think it'll be done much more. Orwell's is much too violent. I think. I think it'll be. The violence will be much smoother.
You would see this problem of the way in which the Canadian University has expanded at such a rate and has brought in large numbers of non-Canadians into the universities as being a very central one in the question of continued survival of even a marginal culture in Canada.
Well, it's the one I'm concerned with, because
yes.
I'm in a, I'm in a university, and I'm just a university person.
Well, what have been the major changes in the, what shall I say, the goals of the Canadian University in the years that you've been teaching in it?
Well, university is a common word, but if you compare, let's say, the U of T with what it was in 1937 to what it is now, I think the word multiversity is much better. And it is a university, it is, and these multiversities are more and more directed to the ends I have called technique, to the masterful control of human and non-human nature. And that certainly dominates the universities to a very great extent. And I think the basis of this is a long thing in terms of the word education meant leading out, leading out. It was Plato's word. It was leading out from the shadows and imaginings to the eternal order. Now, practically nobody believes there is an eternal order. therefore what is to be known but organizing within. Therefore the universities become sort of corporations for organizing the technical society.
Do you think anything very helpful has come out of the unrest of the late 1960s for us in the universities?
This is hard. You know, the time I liked the revolt in the United States, the deepest time I liked the most, was when Sazio was at Berkeley, you know, because, I mean, God, I'd been to Berkeley, and, you know, it just seemed to me a knowledge whorehouse, you know, I mean, just with you know, just nothing. And I admired these youngsters who torn down. Now, I think, therefore, the first step is to see the lack in modern society, to be able to look at the past. Now, I certainly find with a lot of youngsters, they are more willing to, but this is a prodigious activity to understand how we came to where we are.
Well, there of course are some people who've read your some of your writings and have seen them as merely a lament for the decline of the British characteristics of Canadian society. But that's an unfair reading, isn't it?
I think there were certain goods incarnate in certain traditions in Canada that we call British traditions. And I, you know, as practical things, I'm sad for them to go at certain points, you know, certain things. But that they have gone, you know, I mean, you might as well talk, you know, I mean, again, it's like, is the table there? Why talk about it? It's just gone. And I think also, I mean, I'm incomparably more interested in the fate of man in technical society, because that is a universal problem, and a problem that is just inescapable. And I mean, in much greater traditions are going to go than minor loyalist traditions. You know, I'm sorry that certain things go, and I think that I think practical things can be lost in this. I like parts of our tradition. You know, I mean, the constitutional sort of parliamentary tradition, well, that's great as long as it goes on. Now, I am increasingly concerned with issues like what is the nature of modern science, what is the nature of modern reason, what is the, you know, what is the eternal and things like that. My first business is to be a professor of religion.
And all of this rather puzzles me, George, because here you are, the Canadian nationalist on the one hand, and yet on the other hand you're saying the questions which really interest me are universal questions and not really in any profound sense Canadian questions at all. They're Canadian only insofar as they're part of universal questions.
But, I mean, if the greatest question is, you know, how can man be at home? You know, if technological society makes a homeless world, and the great question is how one can be in any sense at home in the world, then one is always at home in the world in a particular place. Do you know what I mean? And what particular, you know, the status of particularity is a universal question, if you see what I mean. I mean, that's a sort of a smart-assed way of answering it in a certain sense. But you see what I mean? I mean, I think the great question is, you know, what Nietzsche calls the death of God went with the death of people having any home. You know, one goes into one eats and sleeps and fornicates in motels, you know, just anywhere, and they're all the same in North America. Why does one feel, or one move from suburb to suburb, why is one at home, etc., 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 etc. I mean, the question of how people can live in this kind of universalized world, you know, is in other words, how you can move back to be a being at home, having passed through the most extreme homelessness, seems to me a universal question, that's what I'm saying. But it affects me, and I'm not only a philosopher, I'm also a father, and so, you know, it affects me in terms of what they're doing to Dundas, Ontario, those highway ministers, you know what I mean, or what they're doing to Nova Scotia, you know,
Yes,
and all this
yeah.
kind of thing.
So it's a problem of rootlessness.
Yes.
Problem of alienation in the contemporary jargon.
Yes.
Well, the Marxist explanation of this is that it's capitalism that creates alienation. Now, I gather from your writings that while you have a considerable admiration for Marx and a considerable disdain for the modern capitalist system, you're not a Marxist.
No, certainly not.
Why not?
Well, I think on the question of this, you know, on the one side, you know, the two great public systems in the world are Marxism and American liberalism. And there's some, and there, you know, at a certain level, the ideological battle seems between those two. And the American liberalism say, well, we have it, the universal world will come in best through liberalism. And the Marxists say it will come best through the Marxist. But I think behind them both, what distinguishes them is not nearly as great as what unites them. The belief in the building of the universal and homogeneous society through the conquest of human and non-human nature, through science. I mean, American liberalism and Marxism are very close in some ways.
So you see,
and I would see them as products of modernity, public products of modernity, but modernity not at its height.
so that the ideological surface is really has an underpinning of the same kind of view of man and view of society, that they're both modern philosophies and they're both messianic.
Oh, very close, very close.
And they're both very powerful.
And both very powerful, yes. Though less and less powerful in a way, isn't it? They're less and less powerful.